In the spring of 2001, the halls of Northwood University in Chicago bustled with the usual rhythm of research, lectures, and late nights in the labs. Among the faculty was Dr. Michael Riddle, a 49-year-old biochemist who had spent 2 decades immersed in his work on chemical preservatives and cellular decay. To his students, he was eccentric but brilliant. To his colleagues, he was stubborn, meticulous, and unwilling to compromise when it came to science. On the evening of April 12, 2001, Dr. Riddle was seen leaving his office with a stack of notes under his arm. The janitor, Clara Jennings, recalled that he was humming to himself, muttering something about one final experiment. According to university logs, he swiped his keycard at the basement entrance around 8:42 p.m. That was the last confirmed record of his movement. The next morning, he did not show up for his scheduled lecture. At first, colleagues assumed he was working through the night, as he often did. But by afternoon, his absence began to raise alarms. His office phone rang unanswered, and his car remained parked in the faculty lot. By the second day, his wife, Eleanor Riddle, reported him missing. She told police her husband had been under enormous stress. He had recently clashed with senior faculty, particularly Dr. Gregory Hale, the head of the department, over research ethics and funding. Michael believed someone had sabotaged his experiments, while others accused him of hoarding data. Tensions inside the department had been simmering for months. The Chicago police opened a missing persons investigation. Detectives searched his office and laboratory. They found his coat still hanging on the back of his chair, his wallet and keys missing, but no signs of struggle. His notes were scattered across his desk, with references to chemical storage and preservation methods. Rumors spread quickly across campus. Some whispered that Michael had fled under pressure, fearing academic scandal. Others believed foul play was involved. But with no body, no evidence, and no witness beyond a late-night keycard swipe, the case remained unsolved. Weeks turned into months. Students graduated, faculty shifted, and the memory of Dr. Riddle faded into the long list of unsolved Chicago mysteries. But for Eleanor, the silence was unbearable. Every day she called the police for updates. Every year, she lit a candle on the anniversary of his disappearance. What no one could imagine was that all along, the answer wasn't buried in another city, nor hidden by distant strangers. It was waiting, sealed inside the very building where he had devoted his life. In the early days after Dr. Michael Riddle's disappearance, Northwood University became a crime scene disguised as a campus. Students whispered in corridors, journalists crowded the gates, and investigators swarmed the laboratories where he had last been seen. Chicago police detectives began with the obvious, retracing his final hours. Security logs showed Riddle entering the science building basement shortly before 9 p.m. on April 12, 2001. Yet curiously, there was no record of him leaving. The university's outdated camera system offered little help. Several cameras near the basement had been broken for years. Detectives interviewed faculty. Most described Michael as brilliant, but increasingly paranoid. He often spoke of sabotage, accusing unnamed colleagues of tampering with his experiments. Several recalled heated arguments with Dr. Gregory Hale, the department chair, over research priorities. Hale insisted the disputes were professional, not personal. "We disagreed about methods, not morals," he told investigators. For police, the case was frustrating. There was no body, no clear evidence of foul play, and no sign of voluntary disappearance. Riddle's bank accounts remained untouched. His passport and credit cards were still at home. Eleanor swore her husband would never abandon his family, let alone his work. The search widened. K-9 units combed the wooded areas around campus. Divers searched the Chicago River, dragging the murky water near the university docks. Flyers with Michael's photograph, dark hair, glasses, serious expression, were plastered across bus stops and train stations. Tips trickled in, but none proved useful. Weeks later, detectives received a call from a former graduate student who claimed Riddle had confided in him about a dangerous breakthrough. The student, visibly nervous, said Michael believed his work on chemical preservation could change forensic science forever, but that someone wanted to steal it. He refused to say more, only adding, he didn't trust the people above him. Despite the ominous lead, the trail went cold. Without physical evidence, speculation took over. The media painted competing narratives. A genius who fled under pressure, a victim of academic rivalry, or even a man consumed by his own experiments. By summer, the case officially stalled. Detectives filed Michael's disappearance as open but inactive. Eleanor refused to let it fade. She held press conferences, pleaded on local TV, and begged the university to keep searching. But as months turned into years, the urgency bled away. The department quietly moved on. Michael's office was reassigned. His research notes were boxed and shelved. Students graduated without ever hearing his name. Still, some things remained strange. Maintenance staff occasionally reported odd chemical smells in the basement. Once, in 2003, a janitor discovered a locked storage room that wasn't on official blueprints. When questioned, administrators dismissed it as old infrastructure. No one connected it to the missing scientist. For Eleanor, each new year without answers was another wound. On anniversaries, she stood outside the science building with candles, staring at the windows of the lab where her husband had last been alive. And deep below, in the shadowed basement of Northwood University, the secret stayed sealed, waiting for the day it would finally be forced open. Time has a cruel way of burying urgency. In the days and weeks after Dr. Michael Riddle's disappearance, the university was buzzing with speculation. But as months bled into years, the story shifted from front-page headlines to a cautionary tale whispered in faculty lounges. By 2005, 4 years after he was last seen, Michael's name had all but disappeared from Northwood University brochures. His office was long reassigned. His research, once hailed as groundbreaking, sat boxed in a dusty archive room. The missing professor became less a colleague and more a ghost story told to new students. That's the lab where a scientist vanished and was never found. For his wife, Eleanor, the silence was unbearable. She lived in the same brick house they had bought in the 1980s, his study left untouched. His glasses still sat on the nightstand, and she refused to move his books from the living room shelf. Each April, she placed flowers outside the university gates and taped flyers on the bulletin boards, reminders to anyone who would look that her husband was still missing. The official investigation, meanwhile, grew colder with every passing year. Detectives rotated off the case, new ones inherited the thick file, and soon it was little more than a stack of paperwork in a cabinet labeled unresolved. A few officers privately admitted what Eleanor never wanted to hear. Without a body, there could be no answers. Yet the questions never went away. Some whispered that Riddle had cracked under pressure and fled the country. Others believed he had been silenced for uncovering something dangerous. Conspiracy forums in the mid-2000s ran wild with theories. A government cover-up, a failed experiment, even secret ties to pharmaceutical companies. The truth was simpler and far more chilling, but no one could see it yet. Inside the university, life moved on. Students graduated, faculty retired, and the science building underwent renovations. But the basement, where Michael's keycard had last been recorded, remained largely untouched. Few ventured down there unless they had to. Some claimed they hated the smell, a mix of rust, mold, and faint chemicals that clung to the air. Maintenance staff filed occasional complaints, but administrators brushed them aside. "It's an old building," they said. "Basements smell." By 2010, nearly a decade after Michael vanished, His case had faded almost entirely from public memory. But Eleanor refused to let go. She organized small vigils, wrote letters to lawmakers, and pushed investigators to reopen the file. She never remarried, never moved, never stopped believing that the truth was somewhere close, so close she could feel it. In 2015, 14 years after the disappearance, a new detective briefly reviewed the case. He noted something strange in the old reports, the unlisted storage rooms beneath the lab. But when he requested access, the university declined, citing safety hazards and structural instability. With no warrant and little evidence, the inquiry went nowhere. The basement remained sealed, its secrets undisturbed. By 2019, 18 long years had passed. Most who had known Michael had either retired, moved on, or forgotten. To the world, he was a cold case gathering dust. To Eleanor, he was a husband she still spoke to every night, his picture framed beside her bed. She could not know that the answer had been there all along, in the shadows of a basement no one wanted to enter, inside a barrel that waited in silence, year after year. In the fall of 2019, nearly 2 decades after Dr. Michael Riddle vanished, Northwood University announced long overdue renovations to its aging science building. Contractors were brought in to replace electrical wiring, repair plumbing, and clear out decades of neglected storage. For most, it was routine maintenance. For one building, it was the unsealing of a tomb. On October 17, 2019, a crew of electricians made their way into the basement, guided by dim flashlights and the smell of rust and mildew. The corridor was narrow, lined with pipes that hissed with steam. At the far end, behind a rusted metal door that appeared welded shut, lay a room no one had entered in years. University blueprints listed it as Chemical Storage C, but even longtime staff admitted they had never seen it used. The workers pried open the door with crowbars. The air that spilled out was thick and chemical, stinging their throats. Inside, the room was nearly empty, except for a single large steel barrel standing upright against the wall. The lid was sealed tight, its edges corroded, but intact, as if it had been waiting to be opened. At first, they assumed it was just leftover waste, but when one worker tapped the side, the hollow echo sounded wrong, muted, as though something heavy sloshed within. Curious, they called campus security, who in turn alerted the Chicago police. Within hours, the basement was sealed off with yellow tape. Detectives and hazmat crews arrived, dressed in protective suits. The barrel was carefully hoisted onto a dolly and wheeled into a forensic van. The crowd that had gathered outside the science building watched in silence as the container was driven away, flashing lights bouncing off the brick walls. Few knew that inside that barrel lay the answer to an 18-year-old mystery. At the county morgue, specialists unsealed the lid. A pungent wave of chemicals, formalin, filled the room. Floating inside the clear solution were human remains, astonishingly preserved. Skeletal but clothed in tattered fabric, the outlines of a body that had been submerged for nearly 2 decades. Among the remains were personal effects, a pair of cracked glasses, a rusted wristwatch, and a university ID card, warped by time but still legible. The name on the card was unmistakable: Dr. Michael Riddle. News of the discovery spread like wildfire. Headlines screamed across Chicago. Missing scientist found after 18 years, body preserved in lab barrel. Reporters swarmed the campus, demanding answers. How had the body gone unnoticed for so long? Who had sealed it away? And why had it been stored not in some distant hiding place, but in the very basement of his own workplace? For Eleanor, the phone call came late at night. Detectives explained what they had found, speaking in cautious, clinical terms. She sat in silence, gripping the receiver, unable to process the words. For 18 years, she had begged for closure, and now she had it, but not the kind she wanted. The discovery shocked the academic world. Professors and former students expressed disbelief. "We walked past that building every day," one recalled. "All that time, he was right there beneath our feet." But the discovery wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. Because inside that barrel, along with Michael's body, investigators found fragments of something else. Documents sealed in plastic, scraps of notes about experiments, and traces of another person's DNA on the lid. It was evidence not of an accident, but of a crime. The discovery of Dr. Michael Riddle's body in a sealed barrel of formalin shook Chicago to its core. After 18 years of silence, the missing professor had been found. But the real story was just beginning. The county medical examiner confirmed the remains were Riddle's, preserved in extraordinary detail thanks to the chemical solution. His death was ruled a homicide, though the exact cause remained undetermined. There were no bullet wounds, no blunt force fractures, but there was something else. Fragments of latex gloves stuck inside the barrel's lid, and partial DNA traces left behind. Investigators pulled at the thread, and soon a familiar name surfaced: Dr. Gregory Hale. The once respected head of the biochemistry department had retired in 2010 and moved to Arizona. At the time of Michael's disappearance, Hale had been his direct superior and his most bitter rival. Old case files showed years of conflict between the two men. Riddle had accused Hale of stealing data and blocking his research. Colleagues recalled shouting matches behind closed doors. One graduate student even remembered Michael saying, "If anything happens to me, look at Hale." At the time, it was dismissed as paranoia. Now it looked prophetic. When investigators reopened university access logs, they discovered Hale's keycard had been used to enter the basement within an hour of Riddle's final swipe on April 12, 2001. Even more damning, chemical purchase records revealed that Hale had authorized a large order of formalin that same week, an order never fully accounted for. Detectives flew to Arizona to question him. At first, Hale denied everything. He claimed he hadn't seen Riddle that night, insisted the formalin was for routine lab use, and scoffed at the idea of murder. But when confronted with the DNA match from the barrel's lid, his confidence faltered. In January 2020, Hale was arrested and extradited to Chicago. The trial that followed became one of the city's most talked about cases. Prosecutors painted a picture of ambition turned deadly. A department chair who felt threatened by a subordinate's discoveries, eliminating him in a way that doubled as a grotesque irony. Preserved forever in the very chemicals he had studied. The defense argued there was no direct evidence of how Riddle died, but the circumstantial case was overwhelming. The access logs, the chemical orders, the DNA. Witnesses testified about Hale's temper, his obsession with reputation, and his hostility toward Riddle. After 6 weeks of testimony, the jury took less than a day to deliver their verdict: guilty of murder in the first degree. Hale was sentenced to life in prison without parole. For Eleanor, the verdict was both relief and agony. She finally had a name, a face, a reason, but nothing could return the years lost or the life stolen in a basement barrel. At Michael's memorial service, she told the gathered mourners, "For 18 years, I left a light on in our home, waiting for him. Now, I can finally turn it off. But the darkness he left will never fade." The case sent ripples through the academic world. Northwood University faced outrage for failing to investigate its own basement, for ignoring staff complaints, for allowing the building to become a tomb. Policies were rewritten, storage areas audited, and laboratories across the country were forced to reckon with their own blind spots. But beyond the reforms, beyond the trial, one truth lingered in the air. Michael Riddle had spent nearly 2 decades hidden in plain sight, his silence echoing beneath the feet of thousands who never knew he was there. The barrel had preserved more than a body. It had preserved a secret, and when it was finally opened, It revealed not just a crime, but the haunting reminder that sometimes the greatest dangers are not hidden far away in shadows, but standing right beside us in the places we trust most.